Well, for now, I feel that the Trump administration's strategy on North Korea is essentially frozen in Hanoi, and that is that the Trump administration insisted that the North take comprehensive steps and commitments to denuclearize, and didn't feel at this summit that there was sufficient commitments made by the North, and that they felt that if they made concessions, they would look vulnerable back home without any major results on the nuclear issue, aside from some relatively minor concessions on the part of the North. So that's where things stand, and it's difficult to see how the Americans pull out some kind of diplomatic and strategic victory out of that. So in the absence of any major strategic initiative, I think this is an opportunity for the Americans to kind of have a look at what Kim Jong-un is bringing to the table here in Russia. We know that the Americans and the Russians, although they have terrible relations in many aspects, are still talking on the nuclear issue. And the Russians have indicated that they still stand firm with the overall international position, which is that North Korea should denuclearize, and then we'll see a reduction of sanctions over time. They disagree on the strategy, but fundamentally, I don't think there's going to be a major shift at this summit.
Do you think that the summit between Pyongyang and Russia is going to help or further complicate U.S. efforts in denuclearization talks, bearing in mind that North Korea just basically threw the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo out of the entire equation for the denuclearization talks? They don't want to have anything to do with him anymore.
I think the DPRK North Koreans want to isolate America. They're obviously very upset about what happened in Hanoi. They want to get the Japanese, the South Koreans, obviously, and now the Russians on board with a much more friendly diplomatic outlook. And therefore, you know, at this stage, the Americans look to be somewhat isolated. But again, the bottom line is this. The Americans do have a seat at the UN Security Council, and they still have significant influence on the sanctions front. So Russia does have a decision to make. Will they start to cooperate with the North by providing them, for example, with fuel, even though the sanctions remain in place? It's likely that the Russians at this stage think that an overall deal is still worth going for, because at the end of the day, they want to keep the Chinese on side, and they also have significant economic interest if a deal is struck. For example, they could provide natural gas through a pipeline all the way to North Korea, and they have that geographic issue. So I think the Russians will want to make play of the diplomatic progress they're making, but fundamentally the situation is not going to change on the nuclear issue.